Good deal. All right, well, here we go. Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us for our monthly webinar series. If we haven't met yet, I'm Bill Middleton, the founder and head coach here at Middleton Elite Coaching. I see a number of familiar friends here with us on the live session, and also hopefully some new attendees as well. Kind of give you the lay of the land for today. We're here to talk about creating urgency, more specifically creating healthy urgency, which I'm going to talk about the distinction in just a second. Getting buyers and sellers off the fence. Kind of the structure of this session we'll do today is I'm going to give you a refresher from a webinar that I did back in like late September, headed into early October, which were 5 predictions for the market for 2024, and to sort of update you on how those have aged over the past 3 to 4 months, and to give you some updates there. We'll also touch the trends in buyer demand and seller supply, which some of you who've been around us for a while know that's sort of the base case or the base model we want to run everything through. Then we're going to get in the topic of creating healthy urgency. The reason I mention healthy urgency is the skills I'm going to teach you are not about how to get people to do something that's not to their advantage. Not that any of you would ever do that. Instead, it's about causing them to be decisive. And I'll walk you through what I think is a very valuable model there for that. And then the 5 signals to watch in the market. All in, we'll go about 45 minutes or so on that. And then we'll have some live Q&A at the end for those of you who are here with us in the live session. Little footnote here, lots of different resources in today's presentation. Please, if you're going to use any of this, cite the appropriate source. We've done our very best to cite the sources throughout the slide deck here, and then we'll also publish that in all of the show notes as well. You're welcome to engage via the chat box along the way. If I can weave it into what I'm doing in real time, great. If not, just hold your question until the Q&A portion at the end of today's session. All right. Let me give you some overarching thoughts on this. As we sit here today, mid-January 2024, in most markets, we're set up for what has been a pretty fast start to the year. I think we're also set up for what is probably going to be a very strong spring market, and perhaps the spring market even arriving sooner than we would have otherwise thought. That is largely because the pretty rapid drop that we've seen in mortgage interest rates over roughly the past 2 months or so. So with that as a base case, let's get into a few things. First, if I go back to our September 2023 session, here were the 5 predictions that I gave you at that point in time. Number 1, that transaction count, so that's like closed units, had bottomed and would likely see modest gains in 2024. That trend line is certainly there. That mortgage interest rates had peaked and would remain in the 6 to 7% for 2024. Shortly after that session in September, we actually saw a little bit of a spike in interest rates, and then they've fallen back down, and I've got some graphs for you on that. Number 3, boomers continuing to have an outsized impact on the market, definitely still the case. Number 4, hold and rent would be the best move up strategy for your buyers or your local sphere of influence. Holding on to house number 1, renting it out, using the cash flow spread between that as a way to absorb their comparatively higher payment in house number 2, the one that they're buying. I've heard from a number of you that strategy worked really well in Q4, and I think we're going to see a lot more of that as we head into 2024. And then number 5, in many parts of the country, inventory will remain a challenge for years. No changes there, and more to follow. So overall, from roughly 3 to 4 months ago, and I know it's early, but these 5 predictions have held up pretty well. And I think all are still in alignment with what our base case is. So let's do a little refresher on base case. I think it's very important that we all understand exactly what's happening in the market and how to maybe even have a little bit of a filter that things move through. There are 3 things that ultimately impact buyer demand. For some of you, this is a refresher. There are 3 things that impact buyer demand. Number 1, net migration, or more people moving into or out of your area. Got some great data for you on that in just a second. Number two, demographic waves. What's happening specifically with millennials and baby boomers, as those are the two largest demographic cohorts that our country has seen ever. And then number three, and this has been the real change over the past few months, what's going on with monetary policy, specifically interest rates. So as you're looking for what's happening in buyer demand, which is one side of predicting the market, you're really reading it through these three lenses. Let's walk you through some details here. This I shared with you previously, but I want to put it back in front of you. These are 2022 data. This is inbound and outbound move rates. We're not going to fully dissect this, but this came from NAR. The thing you need to know about this map is that blue is inbound migration, which represents positive buyer demand. And then red is outbound migration, which is negative buyer demand or outflow. You'll see that they gave you here their top markets by percent gain, and then also the top states. So this is 2022 data. Important to know. Many of you live in some of these markets. This is moving over into 2023 data, just closed out. There are two different studies I really like to look at here. The first one is the U-Haul migration study, and again, we'll link to this in the notes, and you can also just do some quick Google searches and find these. Top 10 inbound states, you'll see them on the left side of your screen. No real surprises, particularly in the top 5. That hasn't really changed over the past few years. There's a number of factors that are causing that, climate, economy, et cetera. Each of these are generally pro-growth, economic growth states and tax advantageous. And so we see a lot of buyer demand coming into those states. Again, that's a positive for your market. Top outbound states, and you'll see no real surprises kind of in the top 3, 4, 5 of these either. This stays pretty consistent. If you're in those states or have colleagues in those states, that could potentially represent some growth in inventory, which we'll talk about over on the seller side. I think these, like this graph here, the U-Haul report, and then this one, which I just took a screenshot of the map just to give you something visual to look at, but this is from United Van Lines. And the reason I look at both the U-Haul report and the United Van Lines report is we can infer a little bit of different information from that. Generally speaking, I'll be very general here, the U-Haul mover is more the do-it-yourself mover, and so that's what you see here. And then the United Van Lines mover is obviously paying for a moving company, so you can infer perhaps some differences in socioeconomics. You could look at this as maybe more of a corporate relocation kind of thing as well. All you need to know about this map is that dark blue is heavy inbound, light blue is moderate inbound, light yellow is moderate outbound, and dark yellow is heavy outbound. So again, if we're looking purely at underneath buyer demand, subpoint number 1, net migration, or more people moving into the area or out of the area, and if we've got a base case there, we're just updating our base case. Bumper sticker version here is that if you're in any of these dark blue states, or if you're in any of these top 10 states from the U-Haul study, your buyer demand picture looks really strong. Okay, let's keep motoring along. Let's get into demographics for a second. This was a really cool slide from NAR, and this is the share of home buyers in each generation over the past decade. NAR did a really cool thing in December that was their annual economic summit. We'll link to that in the notes as well. This is one of the slides from there that I found to be particularly interesting. So let's slow down here for a second and kind of dissect this. You'll see this yellow line here are baby boomers, and you'll notice the share of overall buyers that are boomers going up significantly from 2022 through end of year 2023. And a lot of this stuff you know instinctively. However, this is largely because the boomer cash buyer has not been impacted by the rise in mortgage interest rates. You can see the inverse of that is true with this blue line for millennials and what that line has done over roughly the past 2 years. Okay, hang with me for a second. I did bring my this calls for a spreadsheet mug. So while this isn't a spreadsheet, we are going to nerd out on some numbers for just a minute. Let's get those drawings out of the way. Here's kind of what I want to show you, though. If you just extrapolate kind of this trend line out in this direction, you could see where the boomer trend is going to continue, which we know. You'll also, though, look at the direction the millennial trend was headed. Something kind of like that. This is a COVID dip that most saw, and then this was kind of the post-COVID bump. But if you normalize that line, this line wants to be going that way. Hang tight, we're almost there. So if the line wants to be going that way, but the line is actually down here, everything that's in this wedge right here represents kind of like untapped millennial buyer demand. But what I want you to hear on this part longer term, let's say out 2, 3, 5 years into the future, maybe even in the back part of 2024, this demand did not go away. It didn't disappear. We didn't lose all those millennials. Instead, the can just got kicked down the field a little bit. So I think there's a nice strong trend coming there. The summary point I want to give you here demographically is that you need to be playing with boomers now and into the foreseeable future, and you need to continue to work on your millennial strategy. The reason I emphasize those two groups is because they're just a very, very large cohort in the U.S. Those two groups total almost 150 million people. So that's why it's really a tale of those two groups. Okay, so that's buyer demand. Subpoint number 2, demographic trends and what's happening there. Now let's go to number 3 under buyer demand. We're still just talking about the demand side, and we'll cover the supply side in just a second. We're talking about interest rates now. This is monetary policy. Here's a screenshot from St. Louis Fed, and their source is Freddie Mac for these data. This is the week ending last week, if you're watching this live. And this is a 1-year graph. So you'll see this is from January 11th of 23 to the week ending January 11th of 24. We did our 5 predictions webinar somewhere around about here, and had kind of called that we felt that rates had peaked. Obviously, that was not quite true, because we saw roughly about 6 weeks or so of rates continuing to climb. And then, as you've experienced this rapid, maybe even more so than most of us expected, reversal to the downside there. Very, very pleasant surprise for the buyers in the market, hovering around the mid-6s right now. Okay, if you're not putting a graph like this in your buyer consultations, I would make sure that your buyers are seeing this and understand what's happening with this downward trend in rates. I'll show you in just a minute kind of where most economists feel that is number is going to settle out for the year. However, the couple of things that have happened in real time here is, as these rates have done this, you've seen a few things happen in your market in all likelihood. One is you've seen open house traffic go up significantly. If you haven't seen it yet, it's coming. That's a leading indicator of buyer activity. So a little bonus material here. If you're not polishing off your open house game, do so now. If maybe you have a little bit of a limiting belief around open houses because they weren't all that great in 2023, generally speaking, it is one of the ways that buyers begin to get back in the game as they start showing up at open houses. So just in the first couple of weeks of this year, I've heard a lot of really, really strong reports from our clients and people in our network about open house attendance. Enough on that for now. Let's keep motoring along here to some prediction data. This is what a lot of people want to get tangled up in, is they say, okay, well, that's great. If rates are doing this, then how much lower will they go? And the short answer is nobody actually knows. However, probably the best way to do this instead of guessing yourself, which I don't really like to do either, is to pull people who are way smarter than I am and see where they see rates going. These are a lot of different organizations and their predictions for where they see rates by the end of the year 2024. I'll say that again. These are year-end targets. These targets get updated regularly. Please don't quote this 2 months from now because it might change. I'll give you a quick example. When we did the 5 predictions webinar, the Mortgage Bankers Association had their target at 4.9%. They have revised that to 6.1. And you may say, well, good Lord, Bill, why did they change it so much? And the short version is that there were some analysts who were calling for a recession in 2024. And while anything is still possible, the number of analysts calling for that has dramatically decreased over the past few months. You've heard the phrase "soft landing" used a lot over the past few years, and it seems that most think the soft landing case is probably the most likely scenario now. Those who were calling for much lower 30-year fixed rates by the end of 2024 were also kind of in the camp who were still calling for an economic recession. So I won't nerd out with you too much on that, other than to say, like, just get your eyes on each of these numbers. They're all between 6 and 7. The vast majority of analysts see mortgage interest rates bouncing around between 6 and 7 for the remainder of the year. And then you can use this graph to kind of see where they are and where they've been. The other indicator that you're going to see of increased buyer activity, the Mortgage Bankers Association does a really nice job. Each week, they put out a report about new mortgage applications. They also do it about refi business as well. But new mortgage applications are a good leading indicator of buyer activity. And in the most recent report that I saw that would have been, I guess, data from the first week of January, that number was up 10% compared to the previous week and up double digits compounded over a few weeks, which makes sense. And you know this, and I'm going to slow down for a second and share with you one of the notes that I think is most important for our ongoing discussion. There's kind of 3 things I wanted to make sure I share with you. So write this in your notes, please. Number 1 is knowledge. And the question I ask myself under the header of knowledge is, do I know this or not? So you might be looking at this and say, well, yeah, Bill, I got this. I know this information. I've heard it before, or I study it. Okay, great. So you get a check mark in that box. Or perhaps you're watching this and you're like, well, hey, I didn't know any of this. Well, that's okay. That's why you're here. So the first gap I always want to bridge is my knowledge gap. Now, if I bridge my knowledge gap, now I move on to number 2, which is skill. If I know it, how good am I at communicating that information? Am I explaining this picture to, in this case, my buyers? We'll talk about the seller side in just a second. Am I explaining this well enough to my buyers to be influential or not? So how am I communicating it? And then number 3 is volume. And volume kind of takes on 2 forms for me. So if I know it and I'm good at communicating it, then the volume piece is, am I saying it to enough people? That's lead gen one-on-one. Am I talking to enough people and communicating the messaging around this to them? Maybe you are, maybe you aren't. So that could be an opportunity. The other element of volume is, am I saying it loudly enough? And I don't mean shouting it, yet loudly enough is more about marketing messaging. So if lead gen is the one-on-one, and then marketing becomes now the bigger picture of it. So as we continue to walk through this base case, I'm going to move to the seller side in just a second. As we continue to walk through the base case, I'd like for you to run all this through the lens of knowledge, skill, and volume. You might know some of this. You might not. Are you communicating it enough? Are you communicating it enough with the appropriate amount of skill and influence? So here's one that I think is very, very interesting. And I brought it back from a previous session that we did together. A guy I pay a lot of attention to is a guy named Mike Simonson from Altos Research. He made a comment a while back about people being reactive to the changes in rates versus the absolute value of them. You're like, all right, cool. So what does that actually mean? Here's the way I'd play with this. I have for you a $500,000 loan amount as an example. This is principal, this is interest, just based on like a simple calculator online. So don't hold me to the exact number. You'll get the general idea though. And last we spoke about this a few months ago, we were talking about this number here, 7.5, or we were talking a little bit about sevens. Now we're talking more like 6.5. And there's a group of your buyers out there who are saying, well, I want to wait until rates go lower. They're talking sixes or below. Now, keep in mind, if they're waiting on sixes or below, then they're smarter than all of these people, which is possible yet unlikely. So let's say, though, that they're waiting on something below 6. We're at roughly 6.5 right now. And let's say that they're waiting on 5.5. So $500,000 loan, their interest payment on 6.5 is roughly $2,700. Their payment on 5.5 is roughly $2,300. In round numbers, this is $400 a month. They are delaying their decision to buy over $400 a month in hopes that the rate goes down 1 percentage point, not taking into account, at least in this example, that if rates went down by another point from where they are, what do you think would happen with values of homes? And you all know the answer to that is that they would go up. So the market continues to kind of run away from that buyer. I'm going to give you some data on this also in just a second, but this is some math, again, with my sort of nerdy spreadsheet mug with us today. This is some math that I would make sure that you're reviewing or having your lender colleague. I know there's some loan officers on the live session here with us today, making sure that we're reviewing these differential numbers with the buyers because I think they're emotionally stuck, not mathematically stuck. Okay, other side of the coin. So we had 3 things that impact buyer demand. Those 3 things were migration, demographic waves, monetary policy. 2 things impacting the seller side. 1, resale inventory, and 2, new construction. Okay, resale. Go back to areas of net outbound migration. There are more people moving out than are moving in. If you're in one of those outbound areas, then it's possible that you'll see more inventory growth and some downward pressure on prices. Currently, according to NAR, based on their November data, they've not released their December data yet. We're at 3.7 months of inventory in the US. You'll know also or recall that roughly a balanced market is about 4 to 6 months worth of inventory. So you would basically see like flat pricing at 4 to 6 months. And it's not until you get above 6 months of inventory that you really start to see any meaningful downward pressure on pricing. Every market's different. Every submarket is different. Every price range is different. Knowing this number is very, very important in those niches. And then number 2, new construction. Short-term trends. I like to pay attention to what the National Association of Home Builders seems to think about things. And I'm going to show you some cool data on this in just a second. So we see a recovery in new construction. Larger share of transaction count was new construction in 2023 than the historical norm. And I think we're going to continue to see an increase in new construction, as you'll see here. This came from NAR and their economic forecast. This is single family housing starts. So this is kind of the way that you want to pay attention to new construction inventory that's coming through the pipeline. There's a few things I want to point out to you here, though. First is this green line, which is kind of where NAR thinks we want to be at a minimum. You'll see, you can probably tell there's a little bit of a gap here in 2023. I think this was just builders being careful because they were watching what was happening in rates and they didn't want to get too overbuilt in the short term. The bigger thing that I'll draw your attention to is this big old gap right here. This is millions of units of being underbuilt since the Great Recession. And this is one of the things that's really driving a broader inventory shortage in most markets, particularly markets that are seeing the high net inbound migration, is you have buyer demand coming into the area. Seller supply is not there out of the resale, and seller supply is not there out of new construction yet because of this very large lag that we have here. So there is a long-term trend here where new construction is going to be a very, very prevalent part of what we're seeing in the market. If you're looking for kind of a fun angle there, land development, small local or regional builders, or making sure that you're working your relationships that you might have with your national builders. Very important long-term trend here. Okay, let me pause before I get to this. I'm gonna check in here on the chat box and see if you have any questions on the buyer demand or the seller supply or the direction that those things are headed. You can either hit the little raise hand button if you want to, or type your message in the chat box, and I'll go ahead and grab those now. And if you want to hold it until the end, that's totally fine as well. All right, let's keep moving along then. So that represents your base case. If you don't have a base case, you don't really have a way of knowing the direction that you think the market is going to go. If you already know a lot of this, then it becomes more about communicating it. If you don't know much of this, then it becomes about studying it. If we're studying it and communicating it, we need to be doing it more frequently and more loudly. Now we're going to do kind of a gear change, and we're going to move over into creating healthy urgency. Creating healthy urgency. Most of you are familiar with that. There's kind of two ways to arrive at making a decision. There's a rational way at arriving at it, and then there's an emotional way. And most people tend to be emotional decision makers, and then they use the rational or the mathematical to sort of prop that up. If you've ever found yourself saying, man, they just don't get it, or man, I wish they would listen to me, chances are what you're doing is you're jumping from where they are right now to where you want them to be in the future without moving them through this process that I'm going to teach you right now. So let's talk about the 4 phases of emotional decision making. Number 1 is positive present. So I'm going to use this through the lens of a buyer, but I'll explain in just a second why I think you could also use this for a seller, and it is a very good time to be a seller as well. So you have a buyer who has given you the everything's fine, we're just going to wait. And usually they're going to wait on prices to come down, or they're going to wait on rates to come down, or they're going to wait on the perfect house to come along. They're waiting on something, and they're telling you that everything is fine. And when you hear the word fine, very specifically, when you hear that word, I want you to dig a little bit deeper, because almost always the word fine is a smokescreen. And you know this if your spouse or partner or somebody that's a close friend of yours, and you say, are you okay? And they're like, everything's fine. Chances are it's really not. Okay. They think everything's okay right now. We're moving them to number 2, which is negative present. So negative present is to sort of help interrogate the reality of their current situation. So maybe they're saying to you, well, it's fine that we're living in this house that's too small for us right now, or it's fine that we're living with my parents and have been doing that for a while. It's fine. It'll be okay. Maybe everything's not as good. So I'm going to give you some questions here in just a second that you can use to uncover this. However, one of the things you could do here is, like, let's say they're living in a house that they've outgrown. Very, very common challenge for people right now. You might just do something very simple, like ask them what are the things that they really like about their current house, and then what are the things that they would change or that perhaps they don't like about their current house. It's very important that I'm asking the positive, like, what do you like? And then asking the what do you not like? Because I really want to then later key in on the what do you not like. I'm getting them to self-discover the negative present. I'm getting them to self-discover the downside of their current situation. So ultimately, they begin to think maybe everything isn't as good as I thought it was. All right, so there's your negative present. Now we're going to extrapolate that out, negative future. The negative future sounds like, well, let's say that you decided to wait and prices continued to go up. Let's say that you decided to wait and rates didn't go down any farther. Let's say that you decided to wait and you're still in that house a year from now. You're using time and circumstance to extend the negative emotion. Now, to be clear, I'm not doing this to manipulate them. I'm doing this to make sure they understand that this moment in time is going to compound. And as it continues to compound, they're likely to have a different emotional reaction to it. So you could use a question like, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, let's imagine that it's a year from now and you're still in this house. How would that make you feel? So there's two things I'm a little in the weeds here, but hang with me. There's two things I'll draw your attention to is the phrase, let's imagine. Let's imagine is a phrase that you can use to cause people to think about possibilities. You can use it for positive or negative. So if you were to say, let's imagine that you're still in this house a year from now, and now you can use some of their negative present things, and you don't have enough room for the family, and you don't have a backyard for the dog, and you're still on this busy street that you want to move away from, and it's a year from now. How would that make you feel? So feel is the other thing to underline there. Let's imagine is creative visualization. And then how would that make you feel? Feel is tapping into the emotional response that we're looking for them to have to the compound effect of day after day after day getting to that negative future. I don't want to say something like, what would you think if you were still here a year from now? Think is an intellectual, is a rational word. So I'm looking to key in on things that will trigger creativity and visualization and emotion. So let's imagine and feel are two things that I really want to draw your attention to. So you're moving them to positive future. A couple ways you can get into positive future, and positive future is almost always going to involve your solution to their problem. Now, it might be you just highlighting their solution, but almost always it's going to be your solution to their problem. They're in the idea of negative future. Here it is a year from now, and we still have the small house with no backyard for the dog living on the busy street, and we're not going to feel good about that. So now I need to transition, and I might say something like, are you open to considering, this is another great phrase when we're attempting to persuade. Are you open to considering that now may be a great time to buy? Are you open to considering that prices will likely continue to go up? Are you open to considering that rates may be as low as we're going to see them? Now, I don't actually know factually what's going to happen in the future. I can use all the things that we covered in the first half of today's webinar to educate them and to point them to where we think things are headed. And if you've ever dealt with a stubborn person, this phrase of, are you open to considering, is something that is really, really important. Most people are going to say to you, well, I mean, yeah, I guess I'm open to considering it. Because keep in mind, just a minute ago, everything was fine for them and they wanted to sit in the small house with not enough room for their family, no backyard for the dog, and on the busy street because they wanted to wait on prices to come down or rates to come down or some combination thereof. And we're saying, are you open to considering it? Unless they are super stubborn or super delusional, and you don't want to work with those people anyway, then they're going to say, well, yeah, I mean, I guess I'm open to considering it. In which case you lay out the stuff that we just went through, and then you're going to layer your own market data on top of that, which I'm going to give you an example of in just a second. So this journey, just to summarize all of this, is I don't want to jump from positive present to positive future. So they say everything's fine. And you're like, well, hey, wait a second. Here's what's going to happen with prices, and here's what's going to happen with rates, and you should buy now because I tell you to. Not that you would ever say that, but you're jumping over them feeling the emotional pain of them staying in a situation that they don't want to be in, compounded over time. And it's ultimately that emotion that's going to move the needle. And then you're going to use the math to back that up. So here's some examples of questions that you would ask yourself, or perhaps ask them, for creating healthy urgency. The first thing I want to know is, are they clear about what they want? So whether we're talking about buyers or sellers, this is a consultative process where you're slowing down long enough for them to get clear, and you'll see here in question number 2, for you to get clear about what they want. Here's the biggest misstep I see most salespeople make, is they don't spend the time up front to understand what's really important to the prospect. They either assume that they know, or they do it in bits and pieces. This is particularly bad on the buy side of things if you're not doing a really thorough buyer consultation, and you're out kind of just running around showing houses or piecemealing your questioning around phone calls. We'd really, really love for you to slow down and get clear about what the buyer wants, or if you're representing sellers, about what the seller wants. We got a lot of resources on our website that'll help you do that, and we'll talk more about other programs and offerings that we have before we wrap up today. The second one is, am I clear about what they want? Maybe they're clear, and I haven't done a good enough job to get really clear about what it is that they want and how I can deliver on that. Are they capable of doing that? That's more about, like, are they financially capable? I mean, to be very practical about this for just a second, is if they legitimately cannot afford to buy a house right now, then that's one thing. Perhaps they need to move a little bit farther outside of town to give them that opportunity. How motivated are they to do that? And I would ask that as a scale of 1 to 10 question. Scale of 1 to 10, 10 being you're super motivated to buy, and 1 being you'd be fine if you never bought, or 1 to 10, 10 being you're super motivated to sell, 1 being you'd be okay if you never sold. How motivated are you to buy or sell, depending on who you're talking to? And then they're going to give you some number. Usually those numbers are 3s, 5s, or 7s, but that's a different story. And your follow-up question is, what does blank mean to you? So you say, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, scale of 1 to 10, 10 being you're super motivated to buy, 1 being not at all. How motivated are you? They say 7. Say, great. What does 7 mean to you? And you begin to get their explanation of what that number is. You begin to understand their expectations as part of the consultative process. Do I know what obstacles, either the real ones or the imagined ones, that are in the way of them doing whatever it is that they want to do? What can I do to educate, problem solve, or encourage them through those obstacles? So here's something that you might write down in your notes: is overwhelm will cause people to stall. Overwhelm will cause people to stall. If they are thinking about buying or selling, I think we would all agree that they're going to get overwhelmed with information. They're going to hear it from every friend or family member, probably all well-intended, most of them inaccurate. They're going to be aware of what they're hearing in the news. Some of it's accurate, some of it's not. They're going to be inundated with it on social media. They're going to be doing all their own research, which is totally fine. But just the sheer volume of information that's going to be coming at them could potentially overwhelm them. And overwhelm will cause people to retreat into something that's comfortable. Overwhelm will cause people to stall. So if you can create for them this base layer of knowledge and understanding and education on the front end of the relationship, you've now given them something that they can run through a filtering or use as their filtering mechanism. When crazy Uncle Eddie says to them, there's no reason that they should buy right now because he remembers when houses in their area were $90,000 and the zombie apocalypse is coming and houses are going to be cheap again sometime soon. If you have armed them with some knowledge, then they have a little bit that they can sort of, brush off crazy Uncle Eddie. I put a final note in here for you on this topic. There's a big difference between, and those of you who have been around us for a while have heard this, there's a big difference between telling them, showing them, and them telling themselves. And I think a big gap for most salespeople in our industry is they get really hung up in the, I'm just going to tell them what's happening in the market. And even if you're right, there's a degree of skepticism that your prospects are going to bring to that. What I would love for you to do, and I'm sure all of you are doing a good job of this and improving on it, or you wouldn't be here, is show them the information and let them make their own decisions or their own sort of gather their own understanding about what's happening in their markets. So let me do that for you in real time here in just a second. Here's a slide. This also came from the NAR Economic Forecast Summit that was just a month or so ago. This is annual existing home sales. So this is units sold across the U.S. You'll see here that they've got this green line is at 4 million. Nationally, that number was down 18% in 2023. They said on track because they did this at mid-December. Worst year since 2008 or 1995. So let's go back. Here's 2008, and then here's 1995. Here's the reason this graph is important. The statement that I've made to a lot of people recently is that from a buyer demand standpoint, which is what really you're seeing in this graph, because this is closed transactions, 2023 was the worst year that we've seen in a long time from a buyer demand standpoint. Statistically, 2008, 1995. And nationally, home values were still basically flat, marginally up. Many of the markets that are represented on this call today, and I'll show you some examples in just a second, you still saw one of your worst years in buyer demand ever, and home values still went up. Hear that again. In most of your markets, particularly if you're in those inbound migration markets. It's a little bit different if you're in the net outbound migration markets, but if you're in the net inbound migration markets, you still saw one of your worst years from a buyer demand standpoint in a long time, and prices went up. Stay with me for a second, and let's go back to this graph. And what you've seen, okay, so this is 2023. That's rates. And what you know is that based on that increase in rates, your buyer demand went down. And what you also know is over roughly the past 2 months, if you're watching this live, rates have done that. And then you also know that that has caused an increase in buyer demand. Here we are at 6.6 approximately, increased buyer demand. Here's where, in all likelihood, we're headed. Continued increased buyer demand. And you know that barring any sort of major extreme macroeconomic thing beyond our control, is that that's going to create additional increased buyer demand. So let's look at an example. And in pretty much every market in the country, your MLS or your association of realtors is going to provide you with some similar data. This is Wake County, North Carolina, which is a market where we have a handful of clients. This is Raleigh metro area. And granted, it's a very high net inbound market. However, don't get tangled up in Wake County specifically. Let's just talk about some numbers that are in here so you could carry this through into your own local market area to tell the story. So this is how you're showing people what's happening in your market. Stick with this actuality of buyer demand being lower than it's been in a long time in 2023. I'm just going to focus on the year-to-date numbers. This is the November data because the December data has not yet been released. Should be sometime in the next few days. Closed sales down 16.5%. Pretty close to paralleling the national trend, which was down 18%. I was talking with another client earlier today. Their market was only down about 6% in units. So be sure you know yours. Either way, you could look at it and say buyer demand lower than it's been in a long time. Down 16.5 here in Wake County. And then you'll see if you're looking at both median and average, you still saw modest gains from 0.5 to roughly 3% gain in home values via closed sales in that. So then you just look at this and say, okay, I have a buyer who's waiting on rates to come down. What's the likelihood of that? Pretty low. I have a buyer who's waiting on prices to come down. Well, we just came out of the lowest buyer demand year in 20-something years, and prices still went up in this market. So what's the likelihood of that? So let's talk about sellers for a second, though, because I painted this picture largely from the buyer side today. And there's a few things I'd like for sellers to consider. The easy one is that if they're a seller who's also going to buy in the same market, then there is an advantage to them doing it now because everything indicates, based on what we've covered today, that that number is going to continue to go up. So if they're moving sideways or they're buying bigger, then they'll stand to gain more on the appreciation side of things. In more of a short-term window, though, and I think this is really important, in more of a short-term window, I think there's a first mover advantage to sellers coming to the market now versus waiting on spring. And we don't actually know, but let's say that everything that we're seeing in buyer demand continues. Mortgage applications continue to go up, and open house traffic continues to go up. And then we see what most think are going to happen is kind of a flattening roughly of this line. So just, say that's a floor or something close to it. It seems very unlikely that that's going to continue going this way as sharply as it has, likely to sort of flatten out. So there's going to come a little bit of a time where buyers say, okay, I guess this is as good as conditions are going to get. And you're going to see them, and in some markets, we're already seeing this right now, you're going to see them want to, quote, beat the spring rush to the market on the buy side. And if your seller is in a position where they're taking advantage of that by being on the market now, as opposed to waiting until March, April, May, when seasonality would give them a little bit of a bump, I think you could make a case for going ahead and selling now to take advantage of the move up. That's going to be largely dependent upon your market area and your price range. I think we probably all agree, though, that this spring market, whenever that starts for you, is going to be significantly busier than last year. So buyers who wait are going to miss their window. And then sellers who wait might actually get kind of stuck. Not that they won't be able to sell, but they'll run into a problem where they might not be able to make the move that they want to make on the buy side because they kind of waited it out. And now, yes, they sold their house, but inventory has dwindled and buyer demand has increased. We're already hearing lots of stories about multiple offers, and perhaps you're seeing those in your market back with a lot more prevalence. So anyway, I would encourage you to pull these data every month. I was telling someone recently, when I first got in this business, going all the way back to 2008 and into early 2009, one of my first real estate coaches that I had, and I worked with him for a number of years, every month when this report came out, he had me print it out and carried it around in my pocket until I internalized this. And then randomly on coaching calls, he would say to me, Let's use this one as an example. Hey, Bill, I was looking at the stats that you sent me, and I noticed that units were down 16% in your market this year, but prices were marginally up. What do you think's happening there? And not that we're going to get into that today. However, that would be something that I would need to have an answer for, because it would communicate my overall knowledge of the market. So we're checking that knowledge box. We're almost done with the presentation part, so we'll get ready for the Q&A here in just a second. The 5 signals to watch. You've heard me talk about these a lot today. When you're reading the news, when you're studying a lot of these different reports that come out, when you're doing your own research, when you're talking to buyer and seller prospects, when you're talking to your colleagues, you're looking for 5 signals. Migration, and has that changed in my area, and to what magnitude? Demographic waves, what are the behavioral patterns of those demographics, specifically millennials and boomers? Monetary policy, specifically what's happening with changes in rates. Resale inventory trends, and I put a note in here about seasonality, and that is seasonality relative to buyer demand. So seasonality relative to buyer demand is about, do I list now or do I wait until spring? And are there more listings likely to come in the spring? Yes. Is there more buyer activity likely to be here in the spring? Yes. How does that compare to where we are right now? Who knows? But the point I would make is we know exactly what's happening right now, and we've got really clear data points about what is likely to happen in the future. And I want those folks to be really focused on, they're delaying something. They're not doing something right now because they have a thought about what's going to happen next. Making sure that we're educating them through that. And then number 5, new construction inventory trends. What are builders doing, and is it enough in your area? So if you're watching these 5 signals, predicting the direction of your real estate market is not terribly difficult. And that's what I hope to have communicated today, is both a really thorough understanding of the base case at the national level and how to drill that down to the local level, and then walking you through that cycle of emotional decision making from positive present to negative present. Oh, maybe things aren't as good as I thought they were, to negative future, which is the compound effect of those events over time, and then to positive future with your education-based solution to it. All right. We're going to open this up for live Q&A. A couple things I want to tell you about as you're getting your questions queued up either in your mind or in the chat box. This year, we have rolled out a number of different new offerings from Middleton Elite Coaching, including some one-on-one coaching options for kind of the emerging agent, a group program that is launching soon, a small group that I'll be leading, and then also some in-person training events that we'll be rolling out in Q1. Please stay on the lookout for that via our weekly newsletter and also at middletonelitecoaching.com. Sherry and our team have done a really nice job of helping us put all of those things together. So hopefully with all of this information, you're able to create some more urgency in your buyer pipeline and in your listing pipeline to cause people to act today versus staying on the fence. With that, I'll open it up to any questions. You're welcome to either hit the little raise hand feature and I'll turn your mute button off, or you're welcome to put your question in the chat box. I've got a few minutes that we can hang around for that before we wrap up. All right. Melissa's question, what did I say in the beginning about open houses, that traffic is up? Yeah, Melissa, in short, open house attendance is a leading indicator of future buyer activity. Just last week, I was on a call with all of our coaches and staff at here at Middleton Elite Coaching, and we were discussing what we're hearing from people about open house traffic. Obviously, that's going to vary based on area and on the house itself. However, the summary statement is that open house traffic is up. And I think for 2023, it was very hit or miss because buyer demand was low. But the 2 things I really pay close attention to are open house traffic, and then new mortgage applications, both as leading indicators of buyer activity. If you're in a market where your showings system gives you data, that's another good leading indicator. When you see showings increase, that's generally like a 1 to 2 week leading indicator of buyer activity. A couple other comments here in the chat box. Thanks, Lynette, for your comment there. Helpful stuff about using MLS stats, open house traffic. She's seen that as well. Good deal. Okay. Any other questions, thoughts, or feedback before we wrap up for today? Well, thanks very much, everybody. I appreciate you being here, and look forward to seeing you on a future webinar or event. If there's anything else that we could do for you, please reach out to us via middletonelitecoaching.com, and we'll see you next time. Take care.